Just moments before slipping beneath the icy waves, the Titanic managed to send out a desperate SOS complete with its exact coordinates. That final signal turned out to be a lifeline. Racing through the night, the nearby RMS Carpathia heeded the call and arrived in time to rescue every single survivor. One might assume that with the lifeboats found, discovering the shipwreck itself would be easy. But the ocean guards its secrets well. The Titanic vanished into the depths, and for decades its final resting place remained an unsolved mystery. Finding it became a quest, an epic race among adventurers, driven by passion, pride, and cutting-edge technology. It was in this spirit of rivalry and relentless pursuit that the Titanic was finally found. When the Titanic sank, its last reported location was known. So, the biggest challenge wasn't where to search, but how to reach it. The ship lay nearly 2.5 miles below the ocean's surface, far beyond the reach of any diving technology in 1912. At the time, even wild ideas like blasting the wreck with dynamite to recover bodies were seriously considered, then quickly dismissed as impractical and inhumane. For nearly 40 years, the Titanic lay undisturbed in the deep, while 2 world wars spurred technological advances like sonar and submarines. It wasn't until 1953 that Risdon Beasley, the founder of a British salvage company, decided to attempt the impossible: find and recover the Titanic. Using the distress signal sent out at 10:35 p.m. New York time on the night of the disaster, Beasley had coordinates, but they were only a starting point. The ship had continued to drift for nearly 2 hours before sinking completely, and ocean currents might have carried it far from its final broadcasted position. In the vast, pitch-black depths of the Atlantic, locating a single wreck was like finding a needle in a haystack. Beasley's approach. He dropped small explosive charges over the suspected location, hoping the echoes bouncing off the seafloor could reveal the ship's outline, an early, extremely crude form of sonar mapping. But the results were vague and inconclusive. His expedition failed. It would take another 2 decades before marine geologist Robert Ballard would pick up the quest. In 1977, armed with new underwater mapping technology developed by the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, the race to find the Titanic entered a new high-tech era. Ballard was assigned to test this new cutting-edge technology, but his own objective was to use it to locate the Titanic. There was a hole in the center of the ship where a long pipe could be lowered into the sea just above the ocean floor. Ballard erected a pot with sonar and cameras attached to the end of this conduit, hoping that after the Titanic passed over it, the pot would be able to identify the wreckage. After a few preliminary tests, the mission was abruptly derailed. The hunt was stopped before it could even start when the drill pipe burst, sending thousands of feet of pipe and the pot holding the pricey equipment falling to the ocean floor. Ballard was devastated and humiliated when he had to return to the institution without any clue about the Titanic and without the costly equipment he had been sent to evaluate. More years would go by, and in theory, it should be able to locate the Titanic even in an era when technology had finally progressed sufficiently. It was quite another to have the means to go on such a trip. Hundreds of thousands of dollars may be spent on each trip, and few people were prepared to spend that much money on what might turn out to be a pointless search, at least until Jack Grimm showed up. Grimm was a Texas-based eccentric oil billionaire who was used to searching for the impossible. In addition to funding searches for the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, and Noah's Ark, he had previously attempted to prove the hollow Earth idea by attempting to locate a sizable hole in the North Pole. Grimm was now committed to unraveling the Titanic's mystery. Grimm had the money, but he was missing the other component: knowledge and technology. He was aware that he would require a competent staff with the know-how to operate the necessary equipment. In order to do this, he gave $300,000 to Columbia University's Geological Observatory in New York in return for the people and equipment he required for the hunt. Renowned scientists, Dr. Fred Spies and Dr. William Ryan, would accompany him. Perhaps what's required to locate the ship is an unexpected collaboration between two famous scientists and an oil billionaire who is obsessed with conspiracy theories. Everything appeared to be in place for this expedition to succeed. However, Grimm thought something was still lacking. Grimm, who was always a fan of spectacle, shocked the scientists by boarding Titan a monkey. According to Grimm, this monkey can locate the Titanic by pointing at a map after being trained to do so. Unaccustomed to scientific endeavors being combined with what they perceived as a theatrical performance, Doctors Ryan and Spies were taken aback. Grimm was told explicitly by the scientists that it was either them or the monkey, and they threatened to abandon the mission. They were shocked to learn that Jack Grimm had really selected the monkey. Eventually, more sensible people won out, and Grimm was convinced to abandon Titan, allowing the mission to start. In order to lower a side-looking sonar tied to a cable into the ocean which would be towed along the ocean floor, the team went to the coordinates from the Titanic's distress signal. Acoustic pings are sent to each side by this kind of sonar. In this manner, a tiny area beneath the probe is devoid of data, but on the sides it is possible to swiftly map broad sections of the ocean floor and identify odd bumps and shapes. Once such a shape has been located, it may be determined whether it is metal, that is, whether it is a natural feature of the seabed, or man-made using an onboard magnetometer. In order to accurately mark any regions of interest with coordinates, transponders that would monitor the sonar itself were finally placed into the ocean. However, the crew found nothing despite checking the whole area surrounding the ship's whereabouts. And more the experts began to question if the original coordinates were accurate. The people who escaped in lifeboats were actually picked up approximately here, far farther east than they should have been, even after taking ocean drift into account, despite the fact that the Titanic listed here as its last known location. Because the first officer failed to account for time changes while they were traveling, the scientists hypothesized that the locations the Titanic provided were actually incorrect, and the fact that the actual wreck site was somewhere along the route leading to the fictitious coordinates was the sole reason the Carpathia was still able to save lives. They now think the Titanic had a good chance of being someplace in this 1,500 square mile rectangle because this greatly expands the search region. Now that the previous coordinates had been ruled out, it was time to start looking again. The crew tow the sonar in overlapping lines, a technique often called mowing the lawn. They would annotate anything that caught their attention from the sonar's readings with each pass. However, there was a problem. They were unable to determine whether any of these unusual shapes were made of metal because the magnetometer was broken. To exacerbate the situation, inclement weather threatened the mission as a whole. They persisted in marking every unusual location of interest they encountered, since they were adamant about completing the assignment. Grimm's enthusiasm increased every time they discovered a new one, and this continued until the final region was marked for a total of 14. Grimm would never get the chance to prove it, but he was certain that one of these places had to be the Titanic. They had to return home since time was running out, and the charter for the ship and equipment they were using was about to expire. Unwilling to let up the scientists, and Grimm spent the following year getting ready to go out again, this time with a more sophisticated sonar than the one they had used before. Each location was examined in greater depth one at a time, and each one was excluded as a natural feature. They decided to attempt using digital film as a last resort on the very last day when they were about to give up. The camera would be pulled above the ocean floor while mounted on a sled. The camera was pulled up to examine the footage after passing the path, and while they watched, a new odd shape started to emerge. Upon closer inspection, it began to resemble a propeller more and more. Grimm was certain they had done it right away. They discovered a fragment of the Titanic. But sadly, time was of the essence, and they had to return home before they could continue their investigation. Grimm was prepared to go back out a third time in 1983 to look into this propeller shape because he felt that victory was just around the corner. He kept looking, but he couldn't find anything. Since then, there has been a lot of discussion about what Grimm discovered, including whether the shape was actually a propeller or just a rock. Grimm's own scientist has even disputed what the shape might be. It would never be found again either way. Robert Ballard had watched from the sidelines while Jack Grimm was occupied with his expeditions, discouraged by his own earlier unsuccessful attempt, but not yet prepared to give up completely. Ballard had his own distinct advantage over Grimm, even though he did not have access to vast amounts of money. Connections to the US Navy. Ballard had proposed the design of a new submersible that could be used to find the Titanic to the US Navy. The Navy, on the other hand, was more intrigued by the submersible than the Titanic. Ballard struck a contract with the US Navy. He would have to utilize the equipment to assist them first on a totally unrelated mission before they would finance his project. Ballard concurred and started creating this new instrument for exploring the deep water. Argo, a team on board a research vessel, uses a lengthy cable to connect Argo, a deep towed sled, to the vessel so that it may be remotely navigated above the ocean floor. The sled is equipped with cameras that allow for real-time imaging of the ocean floor and side-scanning sonar. The US Navy intended to look into the disappearance of two nuclear submarines, the USS Thresher and the USS Scorpion, while the Cold War was still in its last stages. Ballard was sent out in 1984 to locate the Titanic on the pretense of testing Argo because they didn't want the Russians to know about this. Actually, he was supposed to map out both submarines' debris sites to determine whether there were any nuclear hazards. Ballard used Argo to research the submarine wreck sites and started to notice something odd about them both. Ballard saw that a debris field surrounded the warships as their wreckages collapsed as they sank more and deeper. The lighter fragments were taken away from the debris, forming a kind of comet trail around it, while the heavier pieces sunk closer to the wreckage itself. Ballard had a thought that started to take shape. A needle in a haystack, everyone had tried to locate the ship itself while looking for the Titanic. But what if you searched for the debris field that was probably surrounding the wreckage rather than the ship? He could follow the comet trail back to the ship if he could locate any pieces of the debris. An epiphany that would alter everything. However, Ballard would still have to wait and carry out his duty for the US Navy before he could hunt for the Titanic. In 1985, he was fortunate enough to be deployed once more to plan out the USS Scorpion. But this time, he would be permitted to use what time he had left with Argo on a Titanic search. Ballard contacted the French oceanographic organization IFREMAR, aware of the short notice, and they came up with a two-phase plan. Jean-Louis Michel of IFREMAR would lead the first portion of the search, while Robert Ballard would conduct the second. The concept was straightforward. Michel would initially use sonar mapping to survey the entire search region, merely to allow Ballard to concentrate his limited time in the second stage to search only the most intriguing locations. These two search areas were developed by them. Michel would start by scanning the ocean floor with a more sophisticated sonar, a process similar to Jack Grimm's lawn mowing method, while Robert Ballard continued to fulfill his Navy duty. Not all of these search terms were precise. Another problem was that the boat would frequently be carried away by ocean currents. Michel had found nothing by the time Ballard arrived to take up the hunt. There were just 12 days left before Ballard would have to return, whether or not he found anything, which added even more pressure to the mounting suspicion that this expedition would fail again. Robert Ballard devised a strategy based on his knowledge of debris fields in order to make the best use of his limited time. He would search for the spacecraft's debris field rather than the ship itself. He was also aware that there was a southerly ocean current on the night the Titanic went down. Lighter fragments in the debris field ought to have moved southward as a result. He calculated the approximate size of the debris field. He began to search now. However, he would draw lines just far enough apart to hypothetically run into this debris field, rather than meticulously covering the entire search region. By separating these lines, he may cover a lot more ground in a short period of time. Additionally, he made the decision to depend far more on the camera feedback than the sonar data. In previous trips, such as the one in which Jack Grimm thought he had discovered a Titanic propeller cameras had been utilized. However, his camera was unable to record live video. Ballard would be depending nearly entirely on the video instead of sonar, and Argo could instead. Every day, his crew would alternate between operating Argo and keeping an eye on the video feed. The crew was starting to feel the weight of the impending deadline as the days went by with nothing except the ocean bottom scenery visible on the camera feed. The crew had to keep themselves awake during the night watch, which was particularly challenging because it seemed like they were witnessing the same natural elements minute after minute. The boulders they were observing, however, abruptly began to resemble man-made trash rather than rocks. They were now riveted on the displays, the hazy pictures becoming sharper. Not rocks, of course. A crewman, not daring to turn away for a moment, flagged down the ship's cook in order to snatch Ballard from his bed. Ballard appeared on the crew's monitors in a matter of seconds, and after a few more tense moments, a larger figure started to fill the screen. They had studied pictures of the Titanic until they knew every detail by heart, so there was no mistake. Argo has just crossed the boiler of the Titanic. They had located the Titanic after 73 years of searching. The ocean currents carried Michel away from the wreck, and it was only 300 feet from where he had previously searched. Celebrations began right away, with everyone on board feeling both astonished and excited. The crew honored the more than 500 people who died in this catastrophe, with a moment of quiet after the euphoria was short-lived as the reality of what they had discovered set in. The team quickly located the ship's stern part after discovering the boiler beside considerably more wreckage. The ship rapidly split in two when it sank, and the bow, which still had its now iconic railing, was found some 800 yards from the stern. Soon after the ship was discovered, there was a desire to retrieve it, a long-held ambition that had even served as the basis for a Hollywood movie years earlier, and lesser items were soon mentioned. One individual, however, had higher goals. A sizable portion of the ship's hull may be salvaged not far from the location where the original boiler was found. Everything was ready on August 27, 1996. Two sizable cruise ships are positioned directly near to the three exploration ships that were circling the location. With thousands of visitors, including Titanic survivors and even celebrities, the salvage effort was supposed to be a media extravaganza. Special bags were attached to the piece using a submersible, and soon it begins to rise from the ocean floor, causing the cruise ships to cheer. Then, however, things begin to go awry. That day, a consortium led by RMS Titanic Inca prepared to lift a huge segment of the hull believed to come from near the original boiler area using flotation balloons filled with diesel fuel. The operation was staged with dramatic flair too, luxury cruise ships, Royal Majesty and Island Breeze stationed overhead carrying VIPs, Titanic survivors, and celebrities like Burt Reynolds and Buzz Aldrin. The whole thing felt like using a French submersible salvage teams attached enormous balloons to the 21-ton hull chunk about 24 x 20 feet in size. As the piece rose through the dark Atlantic, the cruise ship crowds cheered until disaster struck. Rough seas strained the nylon cables holding the balloons. Just 200 feet from the surface, the lines snapped and the hull section plummeted 212 miles back to the seabed. The failure was dramatic and public. Salvage Captain George Tulloch admitted the Titanic's not easy to bring home. Critics were outraged, condemning the attempt as a sensationalist stunt that tampered with a gravesite. Even Robert Ballard called it a carnival. Yet the show did have a silver lining. The effort sharpened the technology and planning for underwater operations. 2 years later, in 1998, a revised mission successfully hoisted the same 15-ton big piece to the surface. It became the anchor exhibit in Las Vegas at the Titanic, the artifact exhibition at the Luxor. The Titanic story is more than a tragedy. It's a tale of human ambition, technological challenge, and the deep mysteries of the ocean. From its final distress call to failed salvage attempts, it continues to fascinate the world. What do you think? Should the Titanic be left undisturbed or explored further? Drop your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing why stories from science and history.